Okay, so anyway, as you know, we're here, it's Blessing Information Day. It's just to find out a little bit more about the blessing and tradition, not just within our own spiritual community, because our own spiritual community didn't start in 1953 or 1960, but it went all the way back to Adam and Eve. And so this is something that, for God has been a long time. Okay, so I'll just introduce myself a little bit about me. As Jess said, most of you know me fairly well. Probably bored out of your mind, Cindy, listening to me rattling away. And the same with Sam. So this is my wife and I. We were blessed in 1982 in Madison Square Gardens. And that's when I had more hair than I do now. We've got 4 children. I think most of you know most of them. That's Robin and Christabel. Again, quite a long time, about 10 years ago now. We've got 2 children. That's Charlotte, who's the oldest, and another one who I've got a photo of. That's Jonathan and Arena. They just came back, stayed in England for a month from Singapore, and last Sunday they went off to Bermuda and to work and lie on the beach. Third son Alexander, it's Elizabeth, and this is us all together just before Jonathan and Rena went off to Singapore a few years ago. Okay, so how did it all start? Well, as I said, our tradition goes all the way back to God and Adam and Eve. And so in the day when God created man, human beings, He made him in the image, in the likeness of God. He created them male and female, and He blessed them. So here you can see, various things. First of all, there's God, and God created human beings. But then God created us in His image and likeness. And the image and likeness of God is masculine and feminine, male and female. So it's not that God is a man or God is just a father, but God is a father and a mother. One God who has the embodiment of masculinity, femininity, a father and a mother. And God created us like Him. And it says He blessed them, and God blessed them. And He said to them, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. So this word blessing that we use, again, it's not, it comes from here. And the word blessing is mentioned many, many times in the Bible. It's a really important idea. So it says here that God, He blessed them. And He blessed them again, and He blessed them again, many, many times. So why do we need God's blessing, and what does it mean? So if we think about what it is to be a human being, what is our existential reality, and, what's the existential reality of every single human being without exception? What do we have? There's only a few of you. I'll do a little bit of questions and answers, see whether you've been paying attention during workshops. Yeah, body and spirit, or mind and body. Now, anybody here not got a mind and a body? I mean, your mind might be somewhere else, but hopefully it'll be here. And so when you die, then your mind and body is separated. So we have a mind and body. There's nothing to do with whether we believe in God or not. This is just the existential reality of what it is to be a human being. We have a mind and body. So what's the other existential reality of every single human being, whether we like it or not? But Elliot? Yeah, sorry, I got reading glasses on, so it wasn't very focused. Okay. Hi. What's the other existential reality of every single human being?
We breathe.
Well, that's the mind-body thing. Different dimension this time. What? Yeah, that's the mind-body thing. Our body goes that way and our spirit goes the other way. Okay. What? Yeah, well, we did that. Okay, whether we like it or not, we exist in relationship with other people. Who here doesn't have a mum and dad? Nobody created themselves. It's just an existential reality of every single human being, whether we like it or not. We exist in relationship with parents and maybe brothers and sisters and neighbors and teachers. We exist in a relationship with other human beings, with other people. And what's the other existential reality, whether we like it or not? Nothing to do with God, it's just this is the way it is. It's another dimension. The three fundamental dimensions of life are the relationship between our mind and body, the relationship we have with other human beings, and what's the other fundamental relationship?
With the earth.
With the earth, that's right. We live in the physical world. Are the laws of gravity optional? Whether you like it or not, if you jump off a skyscraper, you end up like a piece of jam on the pavement. That's just the way it is. So this is our existential reality as a human being. And so as embodied beings, then we also have basic desires. So if you ask most people, most young people, what they want, most young people say, I want to grow up and become an adult. Why? Because then you become a responsible person, you can make your own decisions, your own choices, and about what it is that you want to do with your life. So most people then, they want to grow up and become an adult. Not everybody wants to remain like Peter Pan. Again, most human beings want to, well, all human beings, I think, pretty much without exception, want to have friends. And most human beings also want to get married. And most of the people who get married also want to have children, want to have a family. And why do people have children? I finally figured it out a few years ago. Why do you have children? No?
They have a future.
Follow that on? Yeah, you have. The reason people have children so that they can have grandchildren to enjoy playing with. And most people then want to live a creative life, or at least be prosperous and wealthy. So again, this is also connected to the existential reality of growing up, becoming a mature person, what kind of relationships we have, and our relationship with the natural world. So these are all about desires, and when these desires are fulfilled, then we experience joy. So this is what it says in the principle: desire, which people often consider sinful, is actually God-given. Joy is the purpose of creation, and joy can only be obtained when desire is fulfilled. And so some religions then, they regard desire as being sinful. A sort of misunderstanding of Buddhism says that desire is sinful, but actually Buddha said it's craving, which leads to suffering, not desire itself. So joy is the purpose of creation. Joy can only be obtained when a desire is fulfilled. Though if you don't want anything, then it's very hard to feel joy in that sense. So, for example, if there's someone you love and you haven't seen this person for a long time, you miss them, and when you see them and they walk through the door, your heart jumps with joy and you want to go and give them a hug. You know, yes, I know. Just making it up as I go along. That's the way it is. If you're hungry and suddenly food appears, you feel happy. And you can eat, and you don't feel happy just from seeing the food, you feel happy when you can eat the food. Your desire for food is satisfied and you feel happy. So if we had no desire, we could never experience joy. If we had no desire, we would not have any aspiration to receive God's love, to live, to perform good deeds, or to improve ourselves. So if you never felt hungry, what would happen to you? You'd die. You'd starve. You wouldn't have any motivation to eat. You think, well, it's a waste of time. Yeah. So being hungry, there's nothing wrong with being hungry. There's nothing wrong with wanting to eat. And I think most people enjoy eating and enjoy eating good food in the company of others. What about sexual desire? If there was no sexual desire, what would happen to the human race? They would become extinct. And, the reality is, very few people, what do you call it? In order for the human race to continue, you need to have 2.4 children per couple, isn't it? And now it's sort of less than 2, and a lot of populations are going to demographic decline. And the reality is, a lot of people not having much sex these days. It's just the way it is. And what happened if you didn't want to improve your living standard? Where would you be living? In a cave. Yeah. So the desire to improve one's standard of living, that's a natural desire. These are all good desires which And when when you can move into a nicer house, you can get something which is better, how do you feel? You feel happy. Yeah, if your toaster breaks down and you can't afford to replace it, you're not happy. But if you can afford to replace it and get a nice toaster, you feel happy. So these are desires then. We fulfill these desires, we experience joy. So without desire, neither God's purpose of creation, those three blessings, or providence of restoration could be fulfilled. So the challenge is how to fulfill these desires in a way that is moral and meaningful. And that's why we need God's blessing. So what does blessing mean? So it comes from the Bible. So obviously it's a Hebrew word originally. So the Hebrew is barak, which is translated as blessing, and in Hebrew it means kneel, bless, praise, salute. So you might wonder, what's the relationship between, blessing and kneeling? Well, often when people pray, they get down on their knees. If you want to go, if you're invited to go to Buckingham Palace to be knighted by the Queen, then you will bow and get on your knees. Why? Because the Queen is really short and she might cut your head off by mistake. It's connected like that. So the core meaning is actually knee. So why would it be knee? So what's the weakest part of the human anatomy? It's actually the knees. So when you get frightened, what happens to your knees? They start knocking. Ever had that experience? You're so worried, so scared, suddenly your knees start knocking. And can you control it? Can you stop them from knocking? You ever tried it? Ever been in that experience before? No? Okay, maybe it'll happen one day. Anyway, once you're standing there and you're scared out of your wits, your knees start knocking. It's impossible to stop them knocking. And so that's why when people give speeches and sermons, they're always standing behind a lectern. So even though they look really calm on the outside, underneath their knees are shaking because they're scared. So I'm not scared of you, that's why I'm sitting down here instead of standing up behind a lectern. Okay, so what's a blessing from God then? That's the meaning. A blessing from God is an empowerment to be able to do what is not within our natural capabilities. So without God's strength, without God's blessing, we cannot accomplish all these things. And that's the idea, it's connected to knees. So without God's blessing, people struggle to attain mind-body unity. And sometimes people, they end up becoming alcoholics or lazy or lying or having identity crisis. Without God's blessing, people struggle to attain good relationships. And so very often people get married because they love each other. But as we know, often marriages don't work out. People fall out of love. They get divorced. They get into conflict with their husband and wife, with their kids, with their parents, with the next door neighbor, with the teacher. And, sometimes people end up completely lonely because they fall out with everybody and nobody wants to talk to them. And they just become alone. So even though they want to experience love, even though they want to have friends, because they can't manage that relationship, then they become lonely. And sometimes people struggle to manage the world, such as finances or keeping their room tidy or the garden looking neat. And of course there's the whole green issues of pollution and everything. So this idea here, without God's blessing, it's very hard to realize these desires in a way which is moral and meaningful. And again, sometimes people struggle to find the meaning in life. And sometimes you find that people, they're very good at mind-body unity through sport. They've got a family, they've got lots of friends, they're very wealthy and very rich. But sometimes they feel that life is empty and meaningless. And even though they've got all this wealth and this and this and this, they feel something empty in life. So if we think about then, why did God create us, the universe, and us, or what is the purpose of life? Why did God create human beings? It's a really important question. Why? And this is, to be honest, I'm an RE teacher by profession, and I've studied lots of different religions, and no religion is able to give as good an answer as true parents are given about why God created human beings. Sometimes people say, well, God created us to worship him. Okay. Do you have children so they'll bow down and worship you? Well, if that's what you think your children are going to do, you're going to be mightily disappointed. I remember when Robert, my oldest son, was about 4, and I used to come home from the office. We were living in Moscow at the time, And when I arrived, opened the door, he brought me my slippers. I thought, wow, he's perfect. Anyway, it lasted about 6 months. It's been downhill ever since. So, parents, you don't have children so they'll worship you. So the idea that God created human beings to worship him, which is the explanation basically of Christians and Muslims, is, when you look at it, you think, well, is that a good God to do that motivation? So Father said the most essential aspect of God is heart, and that is also biblical insight. Heart is the impulse to love an object, and is a fountain and motivator of love. It is the nature of heart to seek an object to love. So God, whose essence is heart, feels joy when he can have an object that he created. So as part of human nature, we want to have someone with who we can love. And we look after different things. We may have a cat. We look after and hug and embrace our cat like a pet. And sometimes people graduate to a dog, and but then if you start reading your poetry to your dog, all it's going to do is woof woof. You can't really appreciate the depth of what it is that you want to share, your poetry or your music or whatever it is. So that's why people look for another human being, a friend, and not just anybody. We think, you look for someone who could appreciate and understand your heart, what it is you want to share, and is going to be able to treat your heart as something incredibly valuable, and to be able to appreciate and to be able to respond in a meaningful way. And so often we're looking for someone who's been through similar experiences to our own. Sometimes we have lots of experiences and you think, I can't share it with this person has never been through that. This person doesn't have the capacity to be able to understand what I've been through. You know what I'm saying? And that's why I often talk about soldiers, old soldiers who've been in a war. It doesn't matter which country they were fighting for, they've always been through very, very similar experiences. And they can talk about all these experiences knowing that that other person will have been through similar experiences, can understand what they're talking about and can appreciate it. I won't judge them, I won't accuse them, but well, actually, that was that. And so that's why God then, when he created human beings, he created us in his image and likeness, because he wanted to create beings who had the capacity to be able to appreciate and receive everything that God wanted to give, and to be able to respond in a meaningful way. So that's the same with us. We want, you might meet somebody, you might be going on a journey, on a train, somebody sitting opposite you. You might start engaging in a conversation, and what's the first topic of conversation? The weather. You want to make sure the person understands where you're coming from and is able to speak your language, and you have a conversation about the weather, and then you might move on to talk about sport or football or rugby or whatever it is, and trying to find some kind of common base. In other words, something that both of you are interested in. And then it can move on. You can get really involved in this conversation, you can start talking about music, start talking about all sorts of different things. And you might start to find the conversation goes deeper and deeper and deeper, and you find, I can talk about anything with this person, yeah? And you might both feel exactly the same way. And after, being in a train for a couple of hours, you might feel, I've known this person my whole life. You know what I mean? And then you think, let's meet up again. And, you meet up again, and, you may feel, actually, I want to share the rest of my life with this person. And that's often why people get married, because they feel this is a person with whom I can be completely myself. This is a person who can appreciate everything I want to share, want to give, want to say, and is able to love me unconditionally, despite the way that I am, isn't judging me, and I want to share the rest of my life with this person, and we can actually do things together. So as you could say, well, if we're creating God's image and likeness, well, maybe that's the way God is. Maybe that's the way God created us, like himself. But also, these kind of relationships are always based on free will. There's no compulsion behind it. There's no force behind it. It's all based upon uniting through love. And as Father said, love is, what brings people into unity and is a source of incredible joy. That's why God created us in his image and likeness, male and female. So how to become like God? So St. Paul said, well, you should become imitators of God. And so that's why God gave us the three great blessings then. God is a being of heart, logos and creativity, which is something called unification thought, heart. And so this is this idea here, so through fulfilling the first blessing, becoming a fruitful person, it means we can inherit God's heart. Mind-body unity, we can experience God's heart, we can experience God in our life. And when you get this sort of mind-body unity, life is incredibly joyful. Does anybody here like dancing? Yeah? When it's all working out well, how do you feel? When all your moves are going well, you're completely coordinated, you experience incredible joy. It's the same if you're doing martial arts, the same if you're running or if you're playing snooker or whatever it is. When you've got that mind-body unity, life is really intense and incredibly joyful and incredibly rich. You have that experience when you're dancing? And so sometimes people can dance all night long and they feel completely exhausted but incredibly happy. A very deep sense of joy and fulfillment. And to do with Logos then, that's about human relationships, and which need to be ethical relationships. It's this idea of love and justice to get combined together. And different kinds of relationships here, relationship between parents and children, that's parental love. I'll talk about that later. Anyway, so through fulfilling that blessing, we can inherit God's nature there, and through God as a creative being, God created the universe, so through having dominion over the creation, we can inherit God's creativity, we can become like God. So essentially then, God gave us the three blessings. By fulfilling these three blessings, we can become like God, God's image and likeness. So if we look at the first one then, which is one we work on through our entire life, basically. This is the ability to create and complete our character. As I said, this is an existential reality. It's got nothing to do with God. This is just the way it is. The way I am today is a result of everything I've thought, said and done in the past. That make sense? All the decisions that I make, that goes towards creating my character, what kind of a person that I am. So everything I've thought, said and done in the past, that's the way I am today. And it's the same for all human beings, whether we like it or not. That was one of the great insights of Buddhism. So the good thing about that is I can change the way I think, and if I change the way I think, then it changes the way I feel. If I change the way I feel, I can also look at people differently, and then my feeling towards that person may change. And if my feeling changes, then I can start talking to them differently, and then the relationship itself will change, and then I will change. So, even though we are the result of everything thought, said and done in the past, the good thing is we can change. So the future then isn't determined by the past. The future is always open. No matter what we've done in the past, we can always change the way we think, change the way we feel, change how we speak to people, change how we relate to people, and through that we will start to change, become a different person. And you might think, well, I'm too old to change. Anyway, for me, people often say to me, you haven't changed, William, and I always say, well, it's against my religion. But actually, I have changed. Those of you who knew me a long time ago might remember I was incredibly reserved, I was incredibly unfriendly, I never spoke to people, I was always very shy. I remember when I was a student living here at Lancaster Gate, it was like a community living here, and I remember sitting down at dinner one day, and I wanted the pepper or the salt, but I couldn't bring myself to ask somebody on the other side of the table, would you mind passing the salt or pepper? I was so, shy, reserved, or just self-centered, I guess. Anyway, and that's the way I was. I'm, very English. Anyway, so, traditionally I never really introduced myself to people, but then I found myself, some years ago, I found I'd changed. And this is because some of you may know, my wife was really ill about, I can't remember how long ago, 15 years ago now. And at the time, a lot of things happened such that she was able to recover and get the right medical treatment and everything. And when I looked back on what was going on, I realized that so many people who I'd known suddenly appeared out of nowhere to help in this process. So once I'd been a carp leader in the UK, this is in the mid-1980s, and there's a young Korean girl, she joined in London, and she moved into the centre, and she's a very nice person, but had a very free spirit, and the nature of our spiritual community was a little bit kind of, how should we put it? Anyway, not very free. And I could see she wasn't going to survive, she was going to die if she stayed in our spiritual community. Anyway, so she wanted to leave, and I said, that's fine, that's okay. And so she went back to Canada, and then she went back to Korea, and I never saw her again. Anyway, in 2006, which is a long time, about 30 years later, I guess. Well, maybe, about 30 years later, when my wife was, had certain kind of operations, and she went to Chongpyong to convalesce. And then, completely out of the blue, this young Korean, well, she's no longer young, this Korean girl, Yoon Suk, she appeared on Skype and said, "Oh, this is Yoon Suk, are you William Haynes that I used to know in London 30 years ago?" And I said, "Yeah, hi, it's me, Yoon Suk." And we carried on chatting like we just left off where we finished our conversation 30 years before. So she asked how Ruth was, and I said, "Well, actually, Ruth is in Chongpyong, she's there." So Yoon Suk said, "Oh, I'll go and visit her." So she went up to visit her. I told her Ruth hadn't been so well. It was during the winter, so she took Ruth a nice, warm coat and a sleeping bag, and took us a box of fruit. Anybody who's been to Chongpyong knows they don't do fruit in Chongpyong, and well, at least they didn't then. And that was very nice of her. And then a few months later, my wife went back to Chongpyong, and then at the end of the 40 days, she had a brain hemorrhage and she ended up in hospital. And this was pretty traumatic, because I was here, she was there, and it was a bit of a shock, to put it mildly. Anyway, so while I'm there in a state of shock, wondering what to do in front of my computer, how to do something, then Yoon Suk pops up again. "Hi, William, how are you? Actually, I'm having a pretty rough day." And I explained to her, my wife had just been taken to hospital in Seoul, and she said, "Oh, I'll go along and see her." And so she went to the hospital, she translated, she took care of my son Robert, who'd run out of money, was staying over, took him out to lunch, gave him money, and was a real friend. And this is just one example. So many things like this happened. And I look back and I thought, and I realized, there are a few people whose lives I touched, and suddenly, in this situation, the spirit world or God was able to draw upon the few good deeds which I didn't done in my life to help me in that situation, and my wife. And I remember looking back and thinking, I wish I'd made more friends. I look back and I realized, actually, I've been a really shy, self-centered person, never really reaching out to people, and I just wish I'd made more friends and been a better friend to more people. Anyway, so I got involved in teaching and done program in Slovakia, and I went there very shy. I met people, but I didn't really get to know them or engage much in conversation. But then after I've been doing that for a few years, and suddenly I've found myself, I'm always watching myself, I noticed I arrived, and I just went and introduced myself to everyone and gave them a hug. And I thought, this isn't me. I'm English. I used to hate being hugged. I remember Mark Brown, he joined in America, what do you call this place in America? What?
Camp K.
Camp K, one of these Camp K people. Go around hugging people and choo pow. And I always felt so uncomfortable when people wanted to hug me. And I couldn't understand, why am I going up to people and introducing myself to people I've never met in my entire life and giving them a hug? And I thought, I've changed. And I thought, and I looked back and I realized, I said that little thing. I wish I had made more friends. And I realized that it'd been a prayer. And that little prayer, God had received that little prayer and started working in my life unconsciously through my original nature, and I had been changing, and I become a different kind of person. I'm much happier the way I am now than I used to be. I really am, I'm telling you. But anyway, the reason I'm saying this is I started changing when I was 50. So you may be 18 or whatever now, and you may think, well, I messed up my life, there's no future. But there is. Even if you're 50, you can still change. And just put your life in God's hands and ask God to work in your life. And you don't need to consciously think, oh, I must change, I must change, I must change. Actually, if you just allow God to work, God will change you and make you the kind of person He needs you to be, to fulfill the kind of potential which you have, which God can see, but which you can't see, and which He knows, but you don't know. But if you allow God to work in your life, you'll find yourself blossoming and fulfilling your potential, and God working in your life. And so that's my experience. And I remember once when I was leading a little New Hope team in the late 70s, there was one young man, he joined, and I think he's about 17, 18. And, he was always so unhappy. And I said, what's the matter? He said, my life is ruined, he said. I thought, you're 18? Okay. Tell me about it. He said, well, when I was 16, I got a moped. Can you still get mopeds when you're 16? Yeah? Anyway, he got this moped. Anyway. And so he was driving around with his friends, a little gang with their leathers on, and, driving around, making lots of noise and everything. Anyway, one day, he had an accident, and his moped was written off, and he broke his leg, and he was in hospital. And he came out of hospital some months later, with his leg in plaster, and his moped was destroyed, and he didn't have enough money to buy a new one, and he could no longer go out with his friends, and he felt, my life is ruined. And I said, well, if that hadn't happened, maybe you wouldn't have been open to hearing the principle. Oh, never thought of that before. You'd still be going around with your friends, living a very, in one sense, superficial kind of life. Oh, well, that's interesting. Anyway, so a lot of these things is, one has to reconceptualize these things, look back on one's life and think, okay, just because this happened, this doesn't determine the rest of my life. I may have friends, I may have parents who I think have been dreadful, but that doesn't mean that the rest of my life needs to be dreadful, or I need to be a dreadful parent myself. We can learn, we can change, but we can only do that through opening ourselves up to receiving God's blessing, working in our lives. And that's the whole point of this blessing business. Without God's blessing, it's very hard to go through these kind of changes. I know I wouldn't have changed if I hadn't made that little prayer. I just would have carried on as I had been for the previous 50 years. I don't know why I'm prattling on about this, but anyway, I'm going to run out of time.
William, what's the marshmallow test you got?
Oh yeah, okay, so, well, I haven't got there yet. You're interested in marshmallows, Jeff? Okay, so mind-body unity then is really important. So this part of growing up then is getting mind-body unity, and that's where we get to the marshmallow test. So physical desires should be expressed through spiritual values. So when we're a baby, we do wee and poo when we do it. It just happens. When a baby's hungry, it wants to be fed now. Yeah? So part of growing up then is learning to be potty trained. Yeah? And when a toddler is potty trained, doesn't need to wear a nappy anymore or diaper, it's happy. If it has an accident, it kind of worries because it's no longer in control of itself. So growing up then is getting this mind-body unity, having control over one's physical functions. Also by eating. So, you teach a baby, you start to, fit it into some kind of feeding schedule as soon as you can. And, and then you start saying, well, don't eat snacks between meals. So again, eating then is not just about satisfying one's desire for food, it also then becomes a spiritual activity as well. And sleeping as well. Baby just fall asleep at the most inconvenient times, and they wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And what you want to do is to get a baby into routine so they sleep at the right time. And part of that is the ritual of going to sleep. You get changed, you clean your teeth, you say good night to everybody, you have a good night story, and you say a prayer, and you go to bed in the right place at the right time, in the right way. Yeah. So then it becomes invested with some kind of spiritual meaning. It's not just, flop down anywhere you want in your clothes, etc. So that's mind-body unity, having control over the physical body. And so the most important aspect of this is about promise keeping. You make a promise and you keep the promise. And the most important promise you'll ever make is the vows you make when you get married. So that's why we don't drink or we don't smoke. You know, if you drink, are your dance moves better when you're drunk? No. Can you drive better when you've been drinking? No. Is your health better when you smoke? No. Can you run a marathon better when you're smoking? No. So that's the reason. We don't do those sort of things, because through those sorts of things people become addicted and it destroys the mind-body unity. And so instead of experiencing joy, people experience immense suffering. When someone's addicted to cigarettes and they haven't got a cigarette, they experience this craving. They're really unhappy. I've got to have a smoke. I've got to have a drink. Or I've got to have some drugs. Yeah? People become dominated by the physical body, and that's a state of extreme unhappiness, which is what Buddha said. Craving leads to suffering. That's why it's about getting good mind-body unity. And when we get the good mind-body unity, we experience joy. Life is great. Life is good. And so that's why I don't watch pornography, because again, I'll talk about it later. So marshmallow test, well, that's really interesting. Because it's an example of this. This is some child psychologists. They thought they would do this little test. Got some children into a room, 4 or 5-year-olds, sit around a table. The teacher, anyway, someone who knew them, an adult, came in and said, look, here's a plate of marshmallows. I'm just going out of the room. Now, if you want, you can have one now. If, on the other hand, you wait 5 minutes until I come back into the room, you can have 3. And then the adult walked out of the room, and they're watching through a camera or one-way mirror or whatever, and studying these children. And you could see them. Some of them went straight and had 1. Some went just ate a few. And some of them, they put their hand out. I've got to pull my hand back. No, I've got to wait. If I wait, I can have 3 instead of just 1. And some of them just sat there completely, calmly, patiently, and just waited for the adult to come into the room, and they could have 3. And they followed the trajectories of these children to see how their life turned out. And they found out the ones who were able to delay gratification, in other words, they calmly sat there and waited until the adult came back in, then they could have 3. They were able to concentrate much better and did much better in their schoolwork. They were able to manage their finances, their pocket money much better. When they grew up, they were able to manage their finances much better, and so they got a better education. They ended up more wealthy with a better job, and their relationships turned out better. Whereas the ones who just couldn't control themselves, they got money, and as soon as they got some pocket money, they spent it. As soon as they got some money from their work, they spent it, and they ended up spending more than they actually had and got into debt. And they didn't do so well, they couldn't concentrate on schoolwork, etc., etc. And so life outcomes were much poorer. This is just statistically speaking. It's not everybody, but just statistically, they realize that. And so that's why it's so important then when you, one day, hopefully, God willing, you'll have children and grandchildren, is to teach children delay gratification. Yeah, don't have snacks between meals, etc., etc., etc. It's really important from a very, very young age to encourage children to develop that mind-body unity. And that's a practical application, where words and deeds become one. So how do you fulfill the first blessing? Well, this is it says here, establish a foundation of faith and foundation of substance. At this point, people usually fall asleep, because it's all technical language. So basically, how should Adam and Eve have fulfilled the first blessing? So to fulfill the first blessing then, Adam and Eve should have fulfilled the foundation of faith and substance. So the foundation of faith for Adam and Eve, as you hopefully remember from your workshops, God said to Adam and Eve, don't eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because if you do, you're going to surely die. So what is that commandment? It's don't have sex before marriage or outside marriage, which basically means keeping sexual purity. So the commandment that was there to protect Adam and Eve, because God knew if they got involved in this kind of relationship before they got married or outside marriage, it would be incredibly damaging for them. And, as we know, it's becoming very clear in media and everything now, most damaging thing that can happen to a child, a young person, is sexual abuse. To get involved in this kind of very damaging, harmful sexual relationship is phenomenally damaging and can damage their entire life. So what God wanted then was for Adam and Eve to develop their spiritual life, not to get distracted, involved in that kind of relationship while they're still immature, and to live a life so they're following their conscience, which is basically the foundation of faith then, is keeping sexual purity, developing a spiritual life, so you live your life according to your conscience. That's all the foundation of faith is, really. And then foundation of substance then is achieving maturity. So it's not just about not just about observing the commandment, it's also about becoming a mature person of integrity. So the word then actually become the embodiment or incarnation of the word of God. Just like when you study medicine, you know, all the words are in the book, or nowadays on the computer screen, and you have to learn these things off by heart. And then when you go into the exam and they ask you to identify all the muscles and with the correct Latin name and everything, you can't look it up in the book. You actually have to have taken those words from that book, and they have to go inside you, learn them off by heart so you know the right answer. If you went along to see a doctor and you told your doctor what was wrong with you, what your symptoms were, and he said, well, just give me 5 minutes, I'm just going to enter all your symptoms into Google and see what Google says, you'd think, well, what's the point in going to see the doctor? You'd expect the doctor would have studied all this, would know all this stuff off by heart, and would be able to do these things. So that's all it is, really, becoming a mature person. And if Adam and Eve become mature people, they would become lords of creation, establish proper order in the created world, and this means over the archangels. So as I said, if body dominates mind, people get addicted. Gambling also, computer games, again, it's a big problem here for a lot of young people. You get addicted to computer games, also social media, and all these things, they rewire the brain. And this is a real issue. Put your hands up if you like to get married to a drug addict. Put your hands up if you like to get married to an alcoholic. Put your hands up if you like to get married to someone who's married to his or her computer, wants to play computer games all day long, all through the night. Put your hands up if you like to get married to someone who can't get themselves out of bed in the morning because they haven't got good mind-body unity. This is a reality. We don't want to marry someone who hasn't got mind-body unity. So we have to think, okay, I need to become the kind of person somebody would like to marry. And that means getting good mind-body unity, which means not being addicted to any of these things. And so when people become addicted, it actually rewires the brain. The scientists now, they can scan the brain, they can see if you spend all your time on computer games, a particular part of the brain becomes incredibly dense, new neurons develop. And that's why it's very hard to change, because it's a physical rewiring. That's why it's very hard to break bad habits. So what are the consequences? Okay, that's what the principle says. We can become good only if our body obediently follows our mind. All too often our body rebels against the mind's directions. This is how evil grows within us. For this reason, a religious way of life requires you make the body submit to the commands of the higher mind. So this is really important, mind-body unity. So, supposing anybody here ever felt angry in their life? Nobody else? Okay, we're all doing well. But the reality is we all get angry at some point. The point is, if you lose your temper, what can easily happen? Sometimes people feel anger going up like this. They lose their temper and they take their fist and they go smack, into somebody. And the person might go backwards and hit the pavement and they die. And you get taken to court and you go to prison. You become a murderer. So that's how people become evil, when they can't control these physical desires, like anger. Another one, of course, is lust. Sometimes people can't control the sexual desire, and end up becoming a child abuser, abusing children, or a rapist, because they can't control the physical body, the physical desire, because they don't have good mind-body unity. So why do people engage in such behavior, sometimes substitute for real love? It's often the case. People often eat loads of chocolate as a substitute for love. It's a way to dull the pain of living or trauma. Sometimes people had a really painful, traumatic experience and they want to drown their sorrows and they drink to try and dull the emotion, dull the feelings, or end up becoming a drug addict. So when you see someone who's addicted in this kind of way, it's very easy to judge them, but sometimes, that was their way of trying to deal with a very painful experience or trauma that they had in their life. Of course, it's not a healthy way or a good way to deal with it. Not at all, but sometimes that's why people do what they do. Sometimes a way of escaping. And so I said I'd talk about this very important aspect here, sexual desire. So this is C.S. Lewis. Where have you heard about C.S. Lewis before? No, that's Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland Through the Looking Glass. Who? Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. That's right, Narnia. You might have come across Narnia. Anyway, C.S. Lewis, he was professor of philosophy at Oxford University. And he started out life as believing in God, then he became an atheist, and then he went to teach philosophy at university in Oxford. And one of the subjects he had to teach about was, does God exist or not? And so as a philosopher, he had to think it all through. And eventually he came to the conclusion that God exists. And he wrote his biography called Surprised by Joy. And in this autobiography of his spiritual life, he says, I was the most reluctant convert in the whole of Christendom. In other words, he very reluctantly came to the conclusion that God exists. Because he couldn't, as just a result of the way in which he thought about it, like Abraham, same sort of person. Anyway, so having realized that God existed, then he started to develop and become a Christian and led a very, Christian life and became one of the greatest of the Christian apologists of the 20th century. And it's all the Narnia stories are stories he wrote to introduce Christian theology and Christianity to young children. That's what it's all about. And so he wrote, because of his background, he was able to communicate the Christian message to people very, very clearly in a way which made sense. So he wrote a book, and about all sorts of different topics. So this is one. He wrote books about love, and he said the real problem with masturbation is that it takes a desire which, fulfilled properly, that sexual desire, leads the individual out of himself to complete his own personality in that of another, a spouse. So that's the whole vision of the biblical vision. Through this relationship, you actually become a complete person. Masculinity and femininity. Completes his own personality in that of another, a spouse, and turns it back, sending the man back into the prison of himself, there to keep a harem of imaginary brides. So instead of sexual desire, which one would normally have towards someone of the opposite sex, and at least the development of love and marriage takes you out of yourself, it actually makes a person more self-centered. And it's just a realm of fantasy. And in this harem, so if you don't know what a harem is, in the Orient, people emperors, kings, rich people would often have, half a dozen wives, or maybe 30 wives, or 100 wives, depending how rich they were. And this collection of wives was called a harem. Anyway, it's this imaginary harem in this person's head. This harem works against his ever getting out and really uniting with a real woman. For the harem is always accessible, always subservient, calls for no sacrifice or adjustments, and can be endowed with erotic and psychological attractions which no real woman can rival. Among these shadowy brides, he's always adored, always a perfect lover. No demand is made on his unselfishness, no mortification is ever imposed on his vanity. In the end, they become merely the medium through which he increasingly adores himself. That's the reality. A person becomes more and more self-centered. The reality is, when you're engaging with a relationship with a real person, that person doesn't fit your expectations of how they ought to be. And it means you have to adjust yourself. You have to make compromises. Whereas if it's all in the realm of fantasy, it's very different. And so that's a problem with that. And pornography is the same effect. my father said, who owns the male and female sexual organs. The owner of the husband's sexual organ is his wife. That means, and the owner of the wife's sexual organ is her husband, which means, father said, you can't use your sexual organ to give pleasure to yourself, because through doing that you become more self-centered in the way C.S. Lewis said. We did not know that a person's sexual organ is owned by someone of the opposite sex. This is a simple truth which is undeniable. Typically, a man thinks his sexual organ belongs to himself, and a woman thinks her sexual organ is her own. That is why the world is perishing. Well, he didn't actually join the dots there, but C.S. Lewis joined the dots. You become a more and more selfish and self-centered person. And as the same with looking at pornography. Okay, I think we'll take a break here. And I haven't got very far.
When do you want to come back?
20 minutes?
25 to 12 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, have a good, nice cup of tea, coffee.